Dr. Jared Horvath, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, and welcome to you and to your dog that's in your lap at the moment and might come and go a little bit.
Here's what
What's the dog's name?
her name is Ruby. She just joined me this morning. We're early morning in Melbourne, so she crawled into my lap. So I think she'll be up and around this morning with me.
Okay. Well, Ruby, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
She is also happy to be here.
Yeah, good. Yes. Well, we're going to be discussing your book, Stop Talking, Start Influencing, 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick.
Yes,
Before
sir.
we get into that, though, can you give us a quick tour of your educational path?
Yeah, so I was originally, back in the day, I was a teacher. And so this would have been after I got my undergrad degree at USC down in LA, so just south
Yeah,
of you.
I know it well.
And I studied film undergrad, which afterwards, I guess with like most undergrad degrees, you just kind of go, not really what I love now
Yeah,
after going through a degree. So I got into teaching, really love teaching, and that's my true passion.
yes.
But when I was teaching, that's when the neuroscience stuff started to really kind of perk up and hit the world stage. So I figured if I go back to school and learn the brain stuff, that'll make me a better teacher. So jumped back to Harvard University, got my master's there in educational neuro, started my PhD at the med school there. And then that's when I met an Aussie Sheila. So met a woman from Melbourne and decided
Ah,
to move down here. So I've been down here
ah,
for about 10 years, got my PhD here. Oh, there goes Ruby. And now I work with teachers and students most of the time, just jumping from
y-
school to school, helping them teach and learn and kind of take more control of their learning.
yeah. Well, I watched your TEDx presentation, which was wonderful. Basically, it covered a lot of the ground that ended up in your book. Was that before the book had been completed or
No, that was so
after?
I guess the book was actually written. Goodness, it was completed probably 2.5, 3 years ago, and I just
Okay.
never knew how long the publishing process was. So if you ever want to write a book, when it's done, it ain't done. You still got another
Yeah.
couple of years of editing and tweaking
Oh,
and going
wow.
back and forth.
Yeah.
So the TED Talk was I think end of last year, and the book came out start of this year. But
Yeah.
that's essentially pretty much what I teach day to day is how does the brain work? How do we think? And how do we learn? So it's same topics, but just kind of dance around and changes as I get older. The more I learn, the
Yeah.
more I
Well,
kind of change what
of
I talk
course.
about.
Of course. And we're all really interested in that topic. And I loved your TEDx presentation because you were so animated,
Oh,
really a
thank you.
lively presence. And I think you were putting into practice, the very things that you were talking about in many ways. So I'm sure that wasn't
Yeah.
an accident. But it made me
No,
wonder, did you ever study acting?
not acting per se, but I worked with actors back when I was in film school. So I
Ah,
never took like an acting class, but I when you so I did film production. So we learned you know how to use a camera, how to record sound, all that stuff. But then for one semester, we also learned how to work with actors. So I think I was
uh-huh.
able to maybe draw on some of those lessons as a teacher in the classroom.
Okay.
Holding attention and
Yeah.
just kind of feeling more and more comfortable, I guess, maybe in front of people talking.
Yeah. So you were teaching at the secondary level, is that right? Sort of high school,
Started
junior
middle
high?
school and then moved into high. So I started year 8, so end of middle school.
Yeah.
And then that just extended. By the time I finished and went back to school, I was, goodness, 9 through 12, just depending on what day you got me and what time. They would
Okay.
just be shuttling kids through the room at that point.
Yeah. 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 It's great that you have that as a passion. I think that, that's what kids really connect with. All of us connect with that really is
Yeah.
somebody who presents with great passion.
Yeah,
Um,
that's I can see some teachers get really, after 25, 30 years, they can get pretty
sure.
bored of it. And so I always just say, the day I wake up and kind of am bored, I got to get out of the classroom because kids can pick that up so fast.
Oh
If you're
yeah.
just phoning it in as a teacher, there's no hiding that.
Right, right. So the title of your book, the main title is Stop Talking, Start Influencing. And to me, this implies a critique of something, maybe boring teachers, or was there a sense of critique there?
Yeah, originally it was called, and it makes a little more sense. It was originally called Stop Talking, Start Teaching. And it was a critique of that concept of, yeah, there's a lot of training, and a lot of the time what we do as teachers is we just talk. We just give, 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 give. And that's not always the best way to help people learn. So I kind of draw that line between, there's a difference between presenting and actually teaching, giving information and working with it in a way that other people can embody it and make sense of it. So that was kind of
Yeah.
the original is let's too often we just kind of rest on the idea that so long as I say it, you're going to learn it. And that was what I wanted to combat against and help people
That's not
recognize that
how it works, right?
there's more method to it than that. There's some things you have to
Yeah.
consider, and they're pretty easy, but once you get your head wrapped around the principles of learning, then you have a better chance of designing your presentation or your lesson or your class in a way that'll resonate with others.
Yeah, that's what I love about your book is that, neuroscience, the brain, that's pretty complicated stuff, but you've really pulled out some really key ideas that
Yeah.
people can grasp and hang on to, and you've got great examples running throughout it. What motivated you to write this book, by the way?
It was I think this was when I think about why I went back to school, this was the culmination of that. This idea that I'm teaching is my passion and I'm going to end up back in the classroom when all is said and done here. But this was it as I went back to learn this stuff with the express purpose of saying, if I can figure out how people learn, can I use that to make my teaching better? So I've always had this kind of push in the direction that once I figure out the brain stuff, I'm going to be bringing it back to teachers regardless.
Yeah,
So I think it's the way I've always interpreted my learning, the way I've always made sense of the brain was back through this idea of learning and teaching, learning and teaching. And
yeah,
so finally, this book kind of culminates that and says, this is what I did this for. This is why I came
yeah.
back.
I have the sense that maybe your audience broadened in the process of writing the book. Maybe the publisher leaned on you or something to make it a
That's
little broader.
and that's one thing I didn't expect, but you're absolutely right. Is the publisher sees stop talking, start teaching, and says, "Well, that's a little narrow. You're probably gonna, with the word teaching in the title, turn
Yeah.
off a lot of people. Can we make it for business people? Can we make it for coaches? Can we make it for business trainers?" And
Yes.
at first, I was pretty leery. I'm like, "No, no." But the more I thought about it, the more I kind of learned and studied. The more I said, "You know what? I think we can." So that's where it kind of broadened out to influence to anyone who's teaching anyone anything, parents with
Yeah.
kids. And I'm so as reluctant as I was at the beginning, really happy that they kind of pushed me in that direction, and I think it's better for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow I was able to pick that up. And also, a lot of it is oriented toward people who give PowerPoint presentations because
Yeah,
that's kind of a metaphor throughout about the way that so many of us present
yeah.
information these days. The PowerPoint has almost become a joke in some ways. It's a
It's
kind of a
it's
trope.
kind of like yeah, we go right to it too. It's funny because it I would always see it in presentations, and it was definitely there at uni, but it wasn't really in middle school, high school back when I started teaching. But by
Oh, it
the
is
end
now,
of my
though. Yeah,
yeah, it's now everywhere. It's you can't even
yeah,
in primary school, you'll see teachers with PowerPoints. So it's kind of it's infiltrated everywhere. So I figure we could use that as kind of a good tool that I know everyone will understand. So we could look at the principles of learning through that tool. And the
yeah,
idea being that look, we'll talk about the tool, but really the principles extend beyond it. It's just a really simple kind of example we could use that I knew the audience would totally get. And then once you
right.
get it with PowerPoint, then you'll start to see it everywhere else in your life too.
Yeah. So the subtitle again is 12 insights from brain science to make your messages stick. And of
Yeah.
course, that's what we all want to happen from any kind of presenting, PowerPointing, training, whatever we're doing. So I
Yeah.
think that'll be very useful to people. And I'm hoping you can take us through the 12 insights, but we're probably not going to have time to get through them all. So don't worry about that, because I want you to be able to get into each one with as much depth as you want to, as feels
Yeah.
like for here and now. And
Perfect.
and I think the 12 insights have impacted the format of the book as well. And maybe you can, because, and I don't, I got the book from you in digital form, so I can't hold it up to show people, but
Yeah, yeah.
um,
I'm sure
it's
I have one somewhere in the living room. I'm sitting
yeah,
in my bedroom
that's
now.
okay.
So
We'll limp along without it. Uh, but it's visually broken up into different kinds of components and lots of
yeah,
really great examples of the topics that you're talking about.
that's
So,
what when I was teaching. I kind of have a rule, and I still do it at uni if I have to give lectures there too. Is if I can't get my students to experience a concept, to actually feel it, then I'm not ready to teach that concept yet myself. Um,
yeah,
and I tried to bring that as much as I could into the book. So
right.
I tried to make it as interactive as possible. So as you're reading it, that's one of the best things I heard somebody say is they said, this isn't like a book. This is like an experience. You don't read this,
Great.
you just live it. And
Yeah.
that was exactly what I was going for. So every chapter, there's something you should be doing. There's images, there's quizzes and questions that force you, like halfway through the book, it'll ask you, without closing the book, what was on the cover of this book? Like describe the cover, just to test your
Uh-huh.
memory for that, and then that comes
Yeah.
back to show you some things about learning. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
I'm glad that came through. It's a really
Oh, yeah.
interactive book like that.
Yeah. Well, I have about a 35-year university teaching career behind me, and
Yeah,
always sought to make it experiential,
yeah.
to try to both deliver cognitive content, but also to do it in experiential ways as much as I could.
And
So
that's
I'm glad to see that the next generation is alive with that idea.
still doing it. That is key to teaching. And it's funny when we train primary, we train middle school, high school teachers. We'll let them know this. But at the university level and beyond, we don't ever train that. So a lot of university
Right.
professors never know how to teach. They just assume we just go up and talk. We never really take the time and force them to go through a teaching degree where they learn. If you're not
Right.
experiencing it, you're probably not really learning it all that
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dive into the book. We've been teasing people quite a bit here
well.
for some time. So the first chapter is called Images Plus Speech. So it's a
Yeah.
short, punchy title. What are we getting at?
Well, I think between chapters 1 and 2, I kind of really 1, 2, and 3, I kind of combine into one big nugget in my head.
Uh-huh.
But I think so. There's kind of three principles we can get from them. Principle one is that human beings cannot speak while listening to or sorry, they cannot read while listening to somebody speak simultaneously. So if you ever try and listen to two people speak at the same time, so if you've got like two kids or two students and they're both blasting you with words, you really quickly realize you can't listen to two people speaking simultaneously. You can focus on one, but then the other one just becomes noise, or focus on this one and the other one just becomes noise. But we can never do both. And that's just a brain hardware issue. Easiest way to kind of explain that is we only have one language area. So even though all the sound is coming in our ears, all of that has to get funneled into this one language area. And at that point, we bottleneck. It's one voice or the other, never two. And so that matters with teaching and learning in that it turns out when we silently read something, we turn our silent reading voice. If you listen to what you're hearing in your head, that silent reading voice in our brain is processed the same exact way as an out loud speaking voice. So just like we can't hear two people speaking simultaneously, if we're reading while listening to somebody speak, that we get that same bottleneck and it's one or the other, never both.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
if you're ever teaching and you've got, say, a PowerPoint slide with words on it, or you've got a handout that you give all your people, or a program that they're doing online while you're trying to teach them, they can't do both. It's literally mentally impossible for them to read and listen at the same time. So they have to choose, do I read the slides, do I read the handout, or do I listen to you teach? And unfortunately, most people try and jump back and forth. So
Yeah.
read some slides, listen, read some slides, listen. And as you start jumping like that, you start losing information from both. So you actually learn less by trying to jump back and forth than you would if you just shut down the speaker or didn't look at the screen.
Yeah.
So I guess kind of nugget number one, especially if you're teaching, is if you're forcing your audience to read while listening to you, they can't do it. You've just asked the impossible. And you've probably killed learning, like driven it just down through the
Yeah.
floor, because you've now asked them to do something they can't do, and they're going to struggle with that, and you've made it harder on yourself.
Yeah. One of the big ideas I think that really came through to me, and maybe it runs through the whole book, is that we don't have just one brain. You in your presentation on TEDx, that really comes across.
Yeah.
Not even the triune brain that we have, learned about in neurology type classes, but
Yeah.
many, many brains.
Yeah, we've kind of
Uh,
moved from. I think you remember that. Yeah, you're right. That kind of three-layer brain was back at where we said there's a reptile brain, a limbic system above that, mammalian brain. No, we've moved beyond that now to the point where now we say the brain is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mini brains. We think they're probably more diffuse networks, so you can't think of them like grapes. But the metaphor holds that we're not talking one thing, we're not talking three things, we're talking hundreds of individual things all chugging along doing their own things up here. And we got to take that into account when it comes to learning and teaching, that either A, we're not asking two different clashing networks to kind of go at
right.
it, or B, that we're not trying to funnel too much information through one of those little baby brains. So
Yeah.
sometimes you get a clash, like trying to read and listen, but sometimes you don't. So chapter 2 then goes into this idea that if you can't read while I'm speaking, you can look at images while I'm speaking. That's two different networks. And not only do those not clash, but they actually come together in sensory integration to actually boost the overall learning and signal. So whatever you learn from me speaking and whatever you learn from looking at images, bring those together and you learn more than just the sum of the parts. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. So this is why we say, go back to the idea of kind of PowerPoint or handouts. If you have slides with, say, one relevant image, or one, it could even maybe even be a cute image that's just meant to make you laugh but somehow relates to what you're teaching, people will actually learn more than if you didn't have that image. So you start to see with PowerPoint, it's like take all words away and put one image per slide relevant to what you're saying, and all of a sudden learning, teaching, influence starts to just step up a notch. You don't have to change
I,
much, but
yeah.
people start to learn better.
I totally believe you. I know that to be true. I also know, as a sometime PowerPoint presenter, that it's such a crutch. It can be a
Yeah.
crutch. It's very hard to resist that, because otherwise you're stuck with your memory, and you've got to remember all the little points that you're trying to get across. And
It-
it's so nice to think, or you've got this wonderful quote, and it's only 500 words long, and you want to get that on your slide.
so you throw it up. That's what
But
I
it's
think
not a
we've
good idea.
a lot of people, yeah, they've replaced note cards with the slides. They just use the slides as the note cards, and that's just such a bad idea for your audience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I always say, just I don't know why we stepped away from it, but this idea of having note cards is still totally fine. Look, if I got to teach you and I can't remember every point, I'm allowed to use a cheat sheet. And so long as you don't have to read the cheat sheet as my audience, sure, you might lose eye contact every once in a while I look at my notes, but at least I'm not forcing you to try and cognitively do something you can't do. So I still have my notes and I don't ask you to read them simultaneously. So I think it's totally fine to kind of go back to that idea of note cards or a script if that's what you need to support yourself. That's better than
Yeah.
trying to throw it up behind you.
Yeah. One of the best presentations that I've seen by an academic
Yeah.
was, she had a transparency projector, where you can
Yeah.
lay this transparency on the platen, I guess it's called, and the images up there. And she was dialoguing with the audience and jotting down points to kind of bring out what she was getting from people and then building on that.
Yeah.
And the strength of that over working on a blackboard, which most of us academics do, is when you're working on the blackboard, you've got your back to the class, to your
Yeah.
audience. So she's got very much eye contact and she's just scribbling stuff, but it
Yeah.
was very engaging.
I love, and
And
she's kind of building a concept map as you go. She's kind of
yeah,
building thought as it.
yeah,
So by the end of the lesson, you've got this one big representation of everything you just learned
yeah,
together, and it's was
yeah.
created while that's that sounds like an awesome idea.
Yeah, I thought it was, and I can't say I ever totally took it on, but it was a chastening kind of idea. I
Yeah.
don't think I worked it into my routine.
That's it.
Um,
You, and at the end, that's totally fine. I think at the end of the day,
mhm,
you still have to, as a teacher or presenter or trainer, you always have to know your style. There are going to be
yeah,
some ideas that you can do, some you can't. And so that's
yeah,
why I tend to stay away from people always say, you know, what should I do? And I tend to say it's less, there are no really hard rules on what you're required to do, but there are more hard rules on what to avoid doing just to make it easier. Once you know kind
yeah.
of what not to do, then you get to play with, okay, here's all the options left. What works for me? What resonates best with my style?
I've got a great exercise for you that I think you would like to use in one of your classes that
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
back to the conflict of trying to like listen to two people at the same time and not being able to. It's called simul talking, and it comes from theater games. And
yeah,
so I have a student volunteer to get in the middle, and then two other student volunteers to sit on one side and the other side of the volunteer. And the two people on the side are instructed to start telling a story or talking about something that happened to them, and and or actually I ask people in the class to assign them each a topic to talk
yeah,
about.
yeah,
That gets the class more engaged. So this one's supposed to talk about skydiving, and this one's supposed to talk about baking a cake. And these are
yeah, yeah.
ideas suggested by the class. And the job of the person in the middle is to be listening to both and trying to keep the conversation going and faking as if he's able to listen fully to both sides. So
So like
it's
chime
fun.
in, get a couple words and respond, and then try and
Yeah,
jump back over.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So it gets to be kind of hilarious, but it will really illustrate the point that that you were making about that.
I love that's actually that's a great way to learn that we're hogtied to one voice at a time, and it just
Yeah.
opens up this whole. That's awesome. Oh, I'm definitely gonna play
Yeah.
with that one.
Yeah, good, good. So where are we? We were talking about images and speech. That's in the
Yeah.
first chapter. The second one, you use, uh,
So
and
we kind of
this,
yeah. Chapter one was speech and text. Chapter two is
uh,
images and speech, and then that digs a little deeper into what images work well versus what don't. And I just kind of one big point that I like to always hit is this idea that um, graphs and charts are very different than images. So
yeah.
you can listen to me speak while looking at a picture of a cat just fine. But as soon as I put up a graph where every bar matters and there's numbers, and now we're not talking about images. So
But it's
graphs and
got to
charts,
involve many different brain centers, I would think, to
yeah,
do
and
the analysis of, okay, what is this?
and we forget as when we use them as presenters or teachers, we forget we know exactly where we're looking. The audience has no clue. So you can assume if I pop up a graph and I'm just talking about one bit of it, trust me, my audience, they're losing me because it's going to take them 30 seconds to a minute just to decipher what that's all about behind me.
Right.
So I always say graphs, not the same as images. You can't do a graph while listening to somebody speak simultaneously. You're going
Yeah.
to force them to split again. And then
Yeah.
chapter three then talks about kind of spatial layout and this idea that we tend to, it's totally subconsciously, but really quickly we come to memorize spatial organization. And once we do, we can free up attentional energy and resources to focus on learning other stuff. So if you're giving me a PowerPoint slide and every slide is formatted the same, so pictures are always in the same spot, maybe there's one keyword over here, After about 3 or 4 slides, I implicitly learn that layout, and I can predict it for every slide beyond that. And now I've freed up energy and resources to actually learn better from you. Whereas if every slide, or if you have a handout and every page is just totally different. So there's a picture here, then there's one over here, then there's a word here. When there's no consistency, I actually have to waste energy just trying to decipher each slide as it pops up. So you can use consistency of space to help free up attention and help people learn better from you. Just keeping things consistent actually helps people engage with you easier than they if they have to decode space behind you.
Um, I'm wondering if that translates in other media, like in your being a presenter, not with a PowerPoint.
Yeah,
Is there
yeah.
some way that that principle applies to in other ways to teaching? Do you think?
Yeah, so this is where we now start to you start to see where after about chapter 3 we start to move beyond PowerPoint into these broader themes where now we start to go, okay, if you're, say, a computer designer and you're doing online tech, or you're a health and safety designer and you're designing check sheets for people, for pilots before they fly a plane, here's where you start to see that spatial alignment of documents, spatial alignment of classrooms, spatial alignment of pretty much anything.
Yeah.
If there's consistency, you can drive attention one way, and if there's non-consistency, you can drive attention the other way. So for instance, as a presenter, if every day I've got my kids set up in the same room and I stand in the same spot, cool, that helps free up attention to listen.
Uh-huh.
But if I ever break that, so one day the kids come in and all the chairs are over on this side of the room and I'm now over here, I can force their attention to focus deeply on that switch. So I can use predictability, break the predictability, and force people to focus on what just broke if I ever need to really guide their attention to one specific thing. So it kind of starts to extend out now from just PowerPoint slides into, okay, where's the environment that I'm doing my teaching in? And once I get this principle, again, sometimes I want you here, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I want predictability, sometimes I don't. It all hinges on what's my specific teaching and learning outcome for this task, for this moment.
Yeah. I know I always like to be able to get people into a circle. Often the physical environment wouldn't fit wouldn't allow that. They started putting in these arm desks, that
Yeah.
put your arm
Bolt them
and
into the
write
ground.
on,
They started bolting
and
tables into
and
the ground.
bolting them to the floor
You know,
because and when they weren't bolted to the floor, we would move the chairs off to the side and sit on the floor in a circle
yeah,
and to try to get people more personally engaged with each
yeah,
other and to move from um, uh, there was a phrase, the something on this, the sage on the stage to
yeah.
the guide on the side. I think that's it.
Yeah, so it wasn't everyone sit and look at me. It was, I'm just here to facilitate you guys work with each other.
Right.
Never a bad thing for teaching and learning. The more your students can do, the more your audience is doing, the better they're going to be learning. That's a
Yeah.
guarantee.
Some students, though, have been so conditioned into rows with a
Yeah,
sage on the stage kind of format that that their anxiety goes up.
it,
By the
it
time they're in college and university, it's like that's the way it's supposed to be.
yeah. You see it with adults, and it's one of the funniest things. You get teachers who even know better, and it's like every time you get into, like, it's a professional learning or professional development day, they turn into students again. They sit in rows and they become really quiet and just, and it's like, you guys, you're adults. Where did this come from? Feel free to talk, chat. But you're right. I think we have this implicit understanding of what learning should be. We go into that mode. And once somebody breaks it, it might take 5 minutes for us to feel comfortable. But when
Yeah.
we do, it's always better. Once you get over that little hump of, uh-oh, we have to talk, we have to interact. Oh no.
Right.
Once you get over
Yeah.
that initial hump, everything moves smoother.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, take us on. You've got a chapter named
Keep chugging.
Context and State. Maybe we've been talking about that a little bit. I don't know.
Yes. So you see how it starts to bleed together. So now we move
Yeah.
beyond space, just organization, and we talk about full context. And this is where you learn that when you're learning something, the memories you're forming aren't just for the information you're taking in. The memory also contains everything around you in your physical environment and in your internal environment, your emotions, if you're hungry, if you're hot, whatever you're smelling, but the joke is we never explicitly focus on all of this stuff. It's just implicitly embedding itself into our memories, which means later in the future, if I'm back in the same environment or I'm feeling the same way, it's easier for me to access memories and things I learned when in that same context, in that same state. So here as teachers, we start to learn, okay, how can I set up my context, my environment, the emotions that I'm trying to get people to feel? Can I match those to how I want people to perform? So if I'm teaching you a very specific skill that I know you're going to perform next week over here, can I pull you into that context so the learning matches the performance outcome? Make it easier for you by embedding all this stuff during the learning. Or if I'm trying to teach you something that I want broadly applicable, like basketball, you don't want to just be good at basketball on one court, you want to be good everywhere. So how can I vary my context enough to make sure that your learning allows you to move that everywhere and doesn't just lock it down to one court?
Uh-huh.
So it's just this exploration, yeah, into environment and internal states, and how we can drive that if we're teaching for our ultimate goal for the teaching. What are we teaching
Yeah.
for? How do we lock that into our context?
Yeah. The internal states certainly is something that I relate to as a psychologist, right? What
Yeah,
kinds
yeah,
of internal states are some students will bring internal states with them
yeah.
into the
Oh,
classroom, right? That are
absolutely.
totally blocking learning because they are so wrought up about what's going on at home or in a
Yeah.
relationship or something.
Th- th- There are some states, yeah. It's kind of stress overwhelm. Once you get chronic stress or reach a certain level of emotional overwhelm, you might as well go home. No learning is going to occur at all. So we always say when you have, say, traumatized students or highly stressed students coming into your room, if you don't take the time to get them out of the stress response, that heightened stress response, you've just wasted their time. So the first 5-10 minutes of any lesson has to be reining in and taking control of the emotions of your students. They all have to be there. They all have to be present. They all have to feel safe. And if you skip that, who knows who's learning? But if you own that internal context, that internal state as well, and say, you know what, I'm just going to devote a little bit of time to getting us all on the right page, then you can take everyone on a journey that's going to ensure they're learning things in the way you want them to. So I think
Yeah.
you're spot on. That's a big thing in education now. It seems kind of as stress levels and trauma in our students just seems to be getting higher and higher. That's definitely
Well,
as teachers something we have to take on board.
yeah, it brings to mind the hot topic right now of triggers, of
Hmm.
people getting triggered. And that is a real dilemma there,
Yeah,
between the professors and the students. Professor wants to be free to talk about topics that maybe are somewhat stressful because
yeah.
there's things that can be said about that maybe need to be known on the one hand, and then on the other hand are the students who are saying, wait a second, I can't even pay attention because this topic is, given my history, I can't handle this.
And as much as I hate to say it, I think in a real world settings, we have to, as politicians, as trainers, yep, that's what we have to take into account. As teachers, especially at university level, sorry, that should be totally off the table. As a university instructor, you need to be able to push buttons. That's half the point. Half the point of university is to learn a craft, to learn a skill, to learn a field. The other half is to learn how to think and feel in ways that are conducive to a real world environment, which is uncontrollable. So I think if you're not, as a student at university, if you're not getting angry, if you're not getting uncomfortable, then you're not doing what you're at university to do. You need to be feeling weird. You need to be feeling mad. You need to have professors you hate and professors you love, because you're learning how to be in a world that, guess what, there's going to be people you hate and there's people you love, and you got to learn how to deal with all of them. So that's where kind of the social aspect of education
Yeah, yeah.
in a way trumps the academic aspects of education. But that doesn't, during presentations and employee training, that might not make as much sense. But I think especially at university, that's a really interesting question to kind of dive into.
Yeah, yeah, I like your take on that. I tend to lean that direction myself.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
yeah,
it's when I think back to especially undergrad, the content I learned, it's kind of in there, but there's really not a lot of it.
right.
When I think back, the key things I learned are those classes where I was being pushed by professors, where I had to have debates with people and learn that I can't just yell. You don't win a debate with other students by
Uh,
just browbeating them. You have to have intellectual discussions about it. And that's really what I took away from undergrad. And that's what I try and imbue to my college students is this sense of if if you go through school with me, so whether it's through psychology or education or neuroscience, by the end of your educational degree, your undergrad or higher grad degree, you still won't know what I think. You'll know me as a human being, as a teacher, but you won't know my opinion because I was never giving you an opinion. I was just pushing your opinion all year. Anytime you made an answer, my job as a teacher is to come in and circumvent that answer to keep you thinking. And then you say, well, I think people should do this. And I'll come in and say, great, what about this fact? Or what about this idea? Or what about this story?
yeah,
So I just
yeah,
keep pushing. And at the end, you've thought a lot and you go, well, wait a second, what does he actually think? And I don't care that you know that. My job wasn't to get you to agree with me. My job was to get you to question yourself and expand your thinking.
uh-huh.
And
Okay,
so
well
it's
put.
uncomfortable at the
Yeah,
time, but typically that's when
yeah,
students come back and go, thank you for doing that. It was, I
yeah,
hated it at the moment, but that's really what freed me up and got me to think differently.
yeah, yeah, good stuff.
So I think in a
Well,
way, if you kind of jump forward, I'm gonna kind of zip forward. There's one of the chapters, I don't know if it's 7 or 8, but one of the chapters in the book is on error and this idea that we live in predictions all the time. We think that the base underlying program of the brain is just to predict reality. And so long as that prediction that you're making is even remotely close to what we're experiencing, the prediction trumps reality. We just live in this prediction mode. Anytime you make an error, what's happening is your prediction fails. And the whole brain, the whole system flips into a different mode, which says, uh-oh, we don't know what's going on. Let's learn. We need to take in new information. We need to update our programs, our prediction, because something doesn't make sense. And so going back to this kind of idea of questioning yourself and feeling uncomfortable, a lot of that is predicated on errors, is forcing you to break your own predictions, which allows the body, the system to take in new information, update, and take you to the next level of learning. So errors, when it comes to learning especially, are a teacher's best friend. The more you can get your audience, your students to screw up, to have a prediction and then let that prediction fail, the more they're primed and ready to learn. That's just like the best way to prime the system for learning is to get somebody to commit an error. Unfortunately, like you were saying earlier, you've then got to deal with overwhelm. Is once I commit an error, the system might be ready to learn, but I can turn it off. If I say, no, no, forget that error, I want to go back to my old prediction, I have that choice to kind of shut down at that moment. So how do you get people to commit errors and embrace them at the same time, depersonalize them and start to live there so that they actually learn from those errors? And that's one of
yeah,
the big tricks of being an effective teacher.
yeah, I think so because people will come in with different hereditary tendencies,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
uh, previous familial experiences with being wrong. Being wrong could be very much of a hot button, and
Yeah, yeah.
so some, you know, we all have different personalities and react to everything differently. So to
And it,
but
it
but
makes sense
education
too,
is about
I think
pushing
in,
those boundaries.
and that's in, it's funny because I think we're allowed to do that a lot more in universities, and it's starting to trickle down to high school, middle school, and it's a big topic in traditional education now is how do we get kids to accept errors, to love failure, and kind of build that resilience. But the
Yeah,
joke is the context doesn't really allow it. So we can tell a kid, hey, it's okay to fail. but really they live in a context where if they fail, they don't go to university, or they don't pass a test and they get held back a year. So it's like, on one hand, we're telling them, please be okay with making errors. But on the other, we've built this context where seriously, it's not okay to make an error. So we've kind of ripped them apart. We've torn
Yeah.
them. We say one thing and do another. And of
Yeah.
course, the students, they forget what we say. They adhere to the context to what we do. So
Yeah.
it's
And so they're saying, is this going to be on the exam? And that's their total orientation, is
yeah,
preparing for the exam, preparing because they want to get ahead, they want to make money, they want to be able to have a life and support
boom.
themselves. So there's a real tension there between a
Yeah.
mixed message that,
And I love it that as teachers, you'll find that the tension is in teachers too, because they'll be the first to say, don't ask me that. This isn't about the test. This is about learning.
yes,
But
right,
really,
right,
it
exactly.
is about the test. It's like they say it's not about the test, then don't give the test. Be there and learn.
Yeah,
So there's actually a big movement here. There's 3 schools this year that jumped on, and this is in Melbourne. I'm talking about, where they've just totally scrapped. They finally said it's not about the test, so there will be no test. They've scrapped
yes,
all testing, all grades, all rewards, all any numerical ranking of what you know is gone. And they said to the kids essentially, cool, what are you going to do now? There is no marker. There is no judging you versus this kid. We're here to learn. What are you going to do? And it's been about 3 years since they started. And believe it or not, so these kids, they don't get tested. They just teach and learn. The teachers are beyond happy. For the first time in their careers, they say they feel comfortable again teaching.
yes,
Students are happy. Parents, believe it or not, after an initial shock, are all very happy. And they still have to take, well, they have the option of taking the college entrance exam. So the school doesn't do it, doesn't support it, but if students want to, they're allowed to go out and take it after year 12 or 11. And their scores on those tests, the kids who do take it, are now through the roof compared to when they were
wow,
teaching to the
yeah,
test before,
yeah,
simply by removing all reference to it. And it's
yeah,
almost as if these kids finally learned how to learn.
yeah,
And so there's a lot to be said for, we talk a big game, but very few schools and educators are willing to live that game, change the context. But when you do, kids come along with you. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned that we're kind of
yeah,
playing with now.
yeah. I had colleagues who were pushing that envelope, and there were political realities within the university that they were flying against, right?
Yeah.
Because the whole university didn't embrace that model. And
Yeah.
so
And
there
you know
were
what's funny is, yeah,
very
you
happy students and
but then you have
very
to play
frustrated.
that game as the
Yeah.
teachers. We have our SES scores. We've got, you know what's funny is I'm kind of the, especially at my school now, I'm the anarchist, I guess you'd call me, where, so we have our rules at uni where you have to give X amount of tests, you have to film each lecture, you have to put notes online, or else you get fired. It has to do with access and all this stuff. And I'm very much against all of that, especially the online stuff, because believe it or not, digital, especially when it comes to learning academic material, digital is horrible compared to live. If a kid is sitting in a lecture, even if they're not asking questions, but just being present, they will learn more, better, faster than if they watch that same lecture online while trying to kind of multitask and type and do all this stuff. We know this for a fact, yet we still record things. And so kids just stop coming to lectures. Why would I go to a lecture if I can watch it Friday night whenever the heck I want to? So I've just, about 3 years ago, I essentially said no more. So anytime a lecture starts, they have cameras that automatically kick on. I put tape over the cameras, tape over the microphones, and online I put up slides that say, you should have gone to class. And I have no digital presence. And the teachers, my bosses hate me for it. But at the end of every
Yeah.
semester, my student scores and ratings are so high just because the kids have to come to class that they can't really
Yeah.
fire me. So I, and they keep wondering how I keep getting good results. And I'm like, it's nothing. I just keep telling them it's nothing special. It's about, I force my kids to come to the room, and that's it. When they're here, they have to learn. They don't have a choice. And trying
Yeah.
to cater to their, oh, well, they might be busy. They might have a job. Good. then don't come to university. That's called responsibility. If you can't handle work and learning at the same time, you have to learn how to choose one or the other. It's not my job to cater to them. And so it feels uncomfortable, but lo and behold, students step up to what you ask of them. They rise to the
Yes.
level you expect,
All
and
right.
all my kids do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Now you mentioned multitasking, and you've got a chapter called multitasking in the book.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the point that you were making there, brain wise?
So essentially, kind of like, remember we were talking earlier where we bottleneck if we have two voices, or if we're trying to listen while speaking. We can only do one or the
Mhm.
other. It turns out we have the same bottleneck for essentially any task we're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to do a task, a job, I'm trying to read a book, I'm trying to write an email, whatever it is I'm trying to do, we have what's called a rule set for that task. Um, so this rule set sets your attentional filter. It determines what information gets into your brain, what information gets blocked, what things you can do, what things you can't do. And unfortunately, we only have one rule set slot in our brain. We only have one of those, which means we can only activate one rule set at a time. So if I ever want to do two things at a time, like write an email while talking on the phone or cooking dinner while doing this, I can't do them simultaneously. I have to jump back and forth. I necessarily have to take the old rule set out and bring in the new rule set. And unfortunately, every time I jump, A, I lose a little time because it takes time to switch rule sets. And B, the rule sets start to blend and confuse one another. So I actually start to perform worse. So my timing, it takes me longer, and my accuracy starts to drop because the rule sets start to get really mushy. So at the end of the day, we say no human being in the world can multitask. It's not a skill thing. And I know a lot of ladies think they can do it and men are bad at it. No, no human being can do it. It's a hardware thing. Just like no human being can fly because it's a physical impossibility, no human being can multitask because it's a mental impossibility.
And yet
Um,
our culture seems to be pushing us more and more in the area of demanding multitasking.
and look at the tools we're using right now. We're on a computer, and what makes a computer so cool is the fact that it can do 50 things at once. A computer is the consummate multitasker, and it begs us as the user to try and mimic it. So it's like we've built a society around a tool that, like you just said, just asks us to multitask, just
Yeah.
multitask. And it's
Yeah.
killing productivity and time. I mean, a lot of businesses are finding if you do a 4-hour workday of focused work, you actually get more out of your employees than an 8-hour workday of multitasking. Or let's bring it back to what I love, teaching and studying. If a
Yeah.
kid studies, I kid you not, 25 minutes of focused study on one thing, take a 5-minute breather, come back and do another 25 minutes. So 50 minutes of multitasking free focused study. You'll remember up to 60% more for 6 months longer than if you study that same material for 5 hours while multitasking. So 50 minutes, huge gains versus 5 hours if you try and do that studying while texting, while watching TV, while doing all this other stuff.
What
Multitasking is
about
like,
while listening to music? Many people, not just kids, but many people say, "Oh yeah,
yeah.
I do really well." Personally, I can't do it, but
So here's
uh,
where we get into this issue that, okay, so you can multitask so long as one of the tasks you're doing is on what we call autopilot. So, for instance, like if you're driving your car and listening to the radio, the reason you can sing along to the radio is because the driving is on autopilot. You're not cognitively focused on it at all. And you can tell when you make the switch, when you have to find a parking spot or a street address, the first thing you do is turn down the radio because now you bring the driving back online. So you can do two things so long as one of those things is, we'll just call noise. It's not focused, it's just happening. So in this instance, you can listen to music so long as that music is highly predictable and just on autopilot. So if you put on a CD, like I'm trying to think, like I've listened to a Lionel Richie CD like 1,000 times in my life. So if I just hit play on that and let it run, it's so predictable to me, I can let that go while doing something else.
uh-huh.
But as soon as I put my iPad on shuffle, where every 2 or 3 minutes a new song comes on and it's drawing my attention and I'm going, ooh, I don't like that one. Ooh, let me pick this one. Now I'm multitasking that, and now it doesn't work. So there is an argument to be made that you can listen to music while studying or learning, totally fine, so long as that music is just noise to you, is just predictable autopilot. Once it becomes a signal, we're back into multitasking and it's no good again.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, what else comes to mind? I mean, I'm looking at
Do you
the
want
chapter
to, yeah,
titles here,
do you
but
want to
what?
hit, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Do you want to hit like one more big principle?
Yeah. 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 That'll be about right.
There's one, probably my favorite one is this idea. So it's, how do you make a deep lasting memory? Like, what is the one essential ingredient something needs to form a deep accessible memory? And I think your listeners right now are probably, if I pose that question to them, they're probably already cogitating, coming up with, okay, well, if you want a deep memory, the first thing that thing needs, that moment, that event, has to be highly emotional.
That's
And
what came to mind for me. Yeah.
bingo. And for the longest time, that's what, take it back now, as a neuroscientist, as a researcher, we've been tackling this question for decades. And that was our first thought too, was cool. The more emotional something is, the bigger memory you form. But the more you think, the more you realize that can't be the whole story. Otherwise, why do we remember radio jingles so well? Like a radio jingle, not emotional at all, but I got that. Why do I remember the address of um, the Diamond Jewelers, 1.5 mile east of I-25 off Emporia Street? That was just on a radio commercial I heard growing up as a kid. Why do I
Yeah.
remember that so dang well?
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
emotion tied to that. So we started to go, okay, emotions can't be the whole picture. It must be just pure repetition. The more you hear it, the more you remember it. But then we go, wait, that can't be true. Otherwise, and your listeners can do this, tell me, what does the front of a $1 bill look like? How accurately can you draw the front of a quarter? These are things that we've seen thousands of times. We've repeated these things, put that information into our brain again and again and again. Yet anytime I try and draw the front of a coin, I'm totally wrong. Like I draw it, and then I go back and look, and I wasn't even close. So it can't be pure emotion. It can't be pure repetition. And it turns out when we finally answered this question, we were looking in the wrong space. We were always so interested in how information goes in that we missed the essential ingredient. The key to a deep, lasting memory isn't how the information comes in, it's how you take it out. You want a big lasting memory, you have to access that information. Every time you pull a memory up, that's what makes it bigger, stronger, deeper, longer lasting. Think of something and it becomes easier to think about it in the future. So it's not, we can assume everything comes in about equally, but it's those things we think about more that we tend to remember better. So I always say, we don't think about the things we remember the things we think about. So now we come back as teachers and we start to think, how often do I just try and cram information into you and then wonder why people don't really learn it, when instead I should be getting the information to you and then finding ways for you to give it back to me, for you to access it. So how many times do I just kind of review, last week we learned this, when if I would instead say, you tell me what we learned last week, or everyone write down as much as you remember from last week, or here's an open-ended quiz, answer these questions, or turn to your partner and teach them what we learned. Every time they're accessing that info, that's what's making it deeper. So I kind of call it, so we call this recall. And once you start to think of memory less as input, more as output, then you start to kind of rearrange a lot of your teaching and thinking. And that's where you realize why getting them involved is what helps them learn. It's what helps them form the memories. And the example I always use, because I actually just did this last night, is Game of Thrones. I've watched Game of Thrones once. Like I've only watched that series one time. I've put the information in once, but I could tell you everything about that show because I keep accessing it. I keep thinking about it. I'll go to bed at night and think about the episode I just watched.
Mm.
I'll wake up and I'll talk to my colleagues about it. I'll look up fan fiction. I'm accessing it so much that even though I've seen it once, I'll never forget that show. The memories are now so deep just because I kept pulling them up. So recall, how much and how can we embed ways to get our audience, our students, to pull the information up themselves. And that's going to guarantee they actually learn it, as opposed to us just trying to put it in unique ways. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm wondering though about clinical applications. I'm wondering about trauma.
Yep,
It
yep.
seems like with trauma, there's part of the problem is it's being continually accessed.
So you get this really interesting, and I didn't get to go too deeply in this book in it, but I'm gonna hit it on the next one. Is every time you recall a memory, unfortunately, so it comes out of, we don't know where your memories go in your brain. We don't know where they're stored. But whenever you're thinking about something, it leaves your memory brain and it enters what's called your working memory. So it's essentially in your conscious awareness. And in that moment, you can tweak it, you can change it, you can add to it, you can subtract from it, you can do whatever you want to that memory. And when you put it back, it goes back different. So our memories are constantly changing. Every time you recall it, you're tweaking it and putting it back differently, which on one hand is wildly scary when you think that most of our childhood memories aren't accurate. They reflect how we think they should have been. Every time we think about our childhood events, we tweak it and change it. So go back to Game of Thrones. Chances are, if I ever go back and watch season 1 of Game of Thrones, I'm fairly wrong. My memories are deep, but they're probably not really accurate because I haven't been getting feedback. So every time I think about season 1, I probably tweak it by adding what I already know should happen or what I feel should be going on. So on one hand, it's kind of scary that recall leads to deeper memories, but we're tweaking those memories as we go, which as a teacher, I always say, recall for deep memories, feedback for accurate memories. If you're going to ask your students to pull up information, make sure they have something to reference so when it goes back right. But as human beings now, as adults, A, it's scary, but B, it's wildly powerful when we start to realize this is essentially the entire mode of therapy, is pull up a memory so we can play with it and put it back differently. We're using this mechanism that could be scary for beneficial impact. So some PTSD, exactly what you just said. I recall a bad memory and I make it worse. Recall it, make it worse. And I just cycle this thing until it's debilitating. Therapy says, cool, let's just keep cycling it, but let's make it less debilitating. Think about it and tweak the way you feel, how you're breathing, what you interpret. Put it back slightly different. Think about it again, put it back different. Think about it again, put it back different. And just walk that same system back into a healthier memory. So on one hand, wildly scary, but on the other hand, wildly powerful to help us kind of own our stories and who we are and our own memories.
Great, great. You made reference to your next book. Do you have a clear image of what the next book's going to be?
Yeah, I've got 2 more. So the
Two
next one
more. Wow.
is going to be called The Learning Blueprint. So it's going to take, this first book is Learning Nuggets. So essentially 12 principles of how people learn and think, so we can use that as teachers. The next book is going to go deeper into the learning process. How do we move from information intake to embody to application? So that's going to be more for learners to say, if you ever want to learn something, here's the path you've got to walk. If you have a teacher that just doesn't know any better, cool. You can guide your own learning. So first book for teachers, second book for learning. And then the third book is just going to be my science swan song. It's going to be, now that I've come this far through neuroscience, here's how I understand how science works, how the brain works, and how society kind of takes it on board. So that'll be my bigger picture kind of goodbye to science. Then I'll go back to the classroom and ideally spend the rest of my life just teaching.
Okay. Well, you've got it all
That's my
laid
big
out.
plan.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jared Horvath, this has been fun speaking with you. I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for letting me be a part of it. This has been really fun.